Good evening and welcome to Behind the Headlines. Today is Wednesday, the 12th of May, 2021. And in this programme, there's only one topic that we can discuss today, and that is the fact that Israel is under attack. Over the last 48 hours, we've seen over 1,000 Hamas rockets and missiles fired at Israeli communities in southern and central Israel, even some of those rockets and missiles hitting Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And so this is a program to unpack what is actually going on behind the scenes so that you get the kind of truth rather than relying on the mainstream media's coverage of this conflict. And what we see with what's happening in the news is that it's dynamic, it's very fast moving. And it's also complicated because there are a number of different players involved that make this situation a lot more complicated than it actually is. So in this program tonight, we will be unpacking what's going on. And as Christians, what is our response to this crisis and how can we defend Israel and the Jewish people? Regan, it almost feels like tonight's program, the one of war footing tonight. We are seeing the biggest escalation in violence being targeted against Israel for 7 years, since 2014. And knowing what those rockets and missiles are like, they kill. They kill. And if it wasn't for Israel's Iron Dome, we would be talking about thousands of Israeli casualties right now, instead of just 6.
Well, what we have to remember is this is the goal of Hamas. Hamas desires the end of the Jews. Hamas desires that they have total dominion over the land. So when we hear about 1,000 rockets, I'm convinced, don't know about you, I'm convinced that 1,000 rockets, whether the Iron Dome existed or not, they would be firing 1,000 rockets. So, you know, we've had the Iron Dome intercept so many of those. It has a 90% success rate. We're thankful to God for the technology and the protection that it's provided. It has been put to the test, and now there are questions being asked. A little bit, does it need an upgrade? Because we have had some casualties. Certainly with 1,000 rockets coming in, it's being tested. I saw a video earlier showing how it works, and obviously it's not something that can bear up under a constant barrage. We continue to need to pray fervently that God would equip. This is not de-escalating. It is only escalating at this current stage. We see that, as you indicated, there's some complexity. It's not just on the Hamas front that there's a threat to Jerusalem, threat to the whole of the Jewish state. As we're talking, there are so many adversaries and opponents that are out there, and that's why it's so essential as Christians that we talk about it and give the truth.
No, absolutely, and also we see that Jerusalem is under attack as well. We've seen the violence and the riots on the Temple Mount, where Palestinian rioters have been pre-organised this attack by having lots of rocks available. They've been firing fireworks. And believe it or not, which won't be shown on the kind of mainstream news coverage, is that these Palestinian rioters have been firing these rockets and missiles from inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque that is considered the third most holiest site in Islam. So if it's considered the third holiest site within the Islamic faith, why are Palestinian militants risking it being set alight by throwing fireworks from inside and attacking Israeli police and causing more violence? And of course, what lies behind all of this is the fact that the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, back in January of this year, under the direction of President Biden, called for parliamentary elections, the first time in 15 years. And of course, now he realizes that he wouldn't get re-elected, and that Hamas could actually take over the Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria. And he's scared of doing that. And his supporters are scared of doing that. So he's got to find some way of not losing face. And also he's scared about riots breaking out by Hamas supporters demanding that on the 22nd of May, the elections go ahead. So this is involved, we see, for example, the Biden administration empowering the Iranian regime, wanting to re-engage in the Iran deal. We also see the fact that this has had a knock-on effect on Saudi Arabia, who was building the Sunni Arab coalition against the Iranian regime, looking to improve diplomatic relations with the Iranian regime. And then, of course, you know, the Biden administration has refunded the Palestinian Authority the aid that President Trump cut off. So with all these factors and the Turks getting involved and everything else, it's a messy business, that's for sure.
Well, it's self-defeating, self-harming. This is what we see on all fronts. If you look at, we've talked about Hamas, and we see in Gaza, you know, there has been a just defense and retaliation against the aggression that initiated out of Gaza with rockets being fired on Monday. And there have been tower blocks that have been targeted because Hamas has, as part of its strategy, as part of its history, it places its officials, it places its commanders in spots where there's a high civilian population. So in order for Israel to defend itself, it can only target certain areas with high civilian density. And so while it can minimize to a degree civilian casualties, it can't exclude civilian casualties. Hamas's strategy doesn't work. We've mentioned Hamas, we've mentioned the PLA, you've mentioned Iran and Biden. The other factor is what's happening in Lot at the moment with various Israeli Arabs. There's rioting that's going on. I should say that one of the rockets from Gaza killed an Israeli Arab father and his daughter. So that was on that side, but then as a result of some other tensions going on, Israeli Arabs in Lot are actually burning synagogues.
And it's been called Israel's Kristallnacht. Surprisingly, by many of the Israeli newspapers. So, and this is the new element. The fact that Israeli Arabs now have been involved in this violence puts on a different footing altogether. So just to remind you, we are live, we are interactive tonight, and the question for tonight's program is, why is Israel under attack, and how should we respond? Because we're on a war footing. Let's have a look at this brilliant video produced by the Israeli Defense Force that looks back at the last 24 hours.
צבע אדום בירושלים.
We have here, hi Simon and Regan, we need to be fired up for these last days, and you guys are certainly doing that, and we really appreciate the effort. There's a question asked by the same viewer, Chris. How come these wars are all starting up since the Democrats have returned to power? Is it only a coincidence, or am I a conspiracy theorist?
I think I mentioned that before we went to that video clip by the IDF. Effectively, Biden and the Democrats are dismantling President Trump's Middle Eastern foreign policy, which he promoted the kind of moderate forces in the region. So they formed a coalition against the Iranian regime. And what we're seeing now is Biden completely dismantling it. He stopped the funding of the Palestinian Authority for their hatred and their incitement and their sponsorship of terrorism. And of course, now that's given a green light to Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority and Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad to wage war against Israel. The great danger is, I think, in this one, is that it could escalate. And what we could be on the brink of is a third intifada. And that would be very, very dangerous for Israel. But let's take a step back and think that over the past year or so, certainly since this year, Israel has had the most positive press coverage. Israel has been leading the world in terms of defeating COVID-19, a massive vaccine rollout that has meant that Israelis could take off their face mask and life is pretty much back to normal. They've also then been one of the very few countries that's on the British passport list, green passport list. So you can fly to Israel and visit Israel without having to quarantine for 10 days. You know, it's either Israel or it's Portugal or it's the Faroe Islands. You know, and I know where I'd like to be, despite the current conflict. So Israel was kind of glowing in this international favor and light, good, you know, reasonably good press coverage as well. And then, of course, we have this massive escalation over the weekend in Jerusalem, and now these rockets and missiles raining down on Israel. And I just want to say that if you've ever been to Israel and you've met some of these communities, like in Sderot, southern Israel, and you see how traumatized these people are by these rockets and missiles, it's absolutely horrific and it's scary. And these rockets kill. So when we hear our mainstream media talk about proportionality, there are 56 Palestinians that have been killed in the current conflict. Most of them actually are Hamas terrorists. And the interesting thing is that Israel's carried out over 300 sorties on Hamas positions in Gaza over the past 24 hours, with only 53 casualties, indicates that Israel is doing a very good job in terms of precision bombing, warning Hamas citizens of Gaza to get out when they're carrying out a bombing raid. But also, these bombs kill. These rockets kill. And if you were stuck in one of Israel's tower blocks and a rocket hits, you've got no chance. And Israelis have only got something like 15 or 20 seconds to get to bomb shelters, and those living close to the Gaza Strip have even less. And the trauma that it's caused, the panic, the fear, that it's only sensible and only right that a government's first duty is to protect its citizens. And I'll show you now this excellent video produced by the Israeli Foreign Ministry that shows a courageous brother protecting his younger sister from these rockets and missiles that have been landing on Sderot.
הכל בסדר, הכל בסדר. לא לקום, לא לקום. הנה, נפל.
אני יכול ללכת לבית.
הכל בסדר, את איתי עוד אחד. אלוהים ישמור. הכל טוב, רגע, עוד דקה, שנייה.
אני צריך לרוץ לבית?
רגע, לא, את לא רוצה עכשיו, חכי דקה.
למה אנשים...
This has a personal significance for so many, and my wife, many of the viewers know, is Israeli. She grew up and has spoken on many occasions with me about going to the bomb shelters and being there with her family. We have to remember that in war there are casualties, and oftentimes the greatest casualties are those who are civilians of all ages. And definitely we need to be praying for the peace of Jerusalem, the peace of these individuals who themselves are coming under this attack. We have here from Les, Hamas is a murderous political group that does not care about the people in Gaza. They fire rockets from areas of civilian population, treating them as cannon fodder for their own twisted ideology. They want the destruction of Israel, simple as that. We also have this from Satindir. Greetings to you both. Hamas has been using residential areas to store and fire rockets from, knowing full well that when Israel responds, it will get the blame for an unproportioned response. However, Israel does warn the civilian population, as you said a moment ago, Simon, beforehand of any attack, something Hamas would never do. These tit-for-tat wars have gone on long enough. Any ceasefire is only going to be broken by these radical groups sooner or later. It's time Israel went in and dealt with them decisively once and for all. These delays.
They won't do that because they fear something else is worse. I mean, imagining controlling a population of over 1 million residents of Gaza, and Israel's done it before. Israel's biggest mistake was pulling out of Gush Katif back in 2005 and pulling the Jewish settlements out of there in a demonstration of how Israel was committed to peace. There was something like a £16 million greenhouse there with the exotic fruits produced, and the Palestinian militants destroyed it completely. So the fact is, if Israeli troops went in, they'd have to then try and govern Gaza, just be absolutely impossible. So they fear something else. So their policy is one of containment, but also the fact that Hamas fire their rockets and missiles from schools, from hospitals, from zoos. They even fire them from ambulances and even hospitals as well. And they deliberately, as you say earlier, put civilians, I mean, we're talking here men and women, in harm's way. And that is what makes this shocking, because they do not comply to the Geneva Convention on Warfare. And Israel then has to respond to protect its citizens. And the great danger is now that we're already seeing a big build-up of Israeli reservists on the Gaza.
Over 5,000?
Over 5,000 at the moment. And if this escalates and it continues, then we could see a ground offensive to deal with that rocket and missile threat. But one thing Israel hasn't done since 2014, the last war, is that it's given Hamas a chance to rebuild its rockets and missiles. But at the moment, we don't know who's really running the show there. You know, we see that the Iranians are wanting to instigate violence and trouble in the Gaza Strip through their proxies, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, as well as Hamas. So there is competing factions within the Gaza Strip. And of course, it's all about as well that the Palestinian Authority and those on the outside of the leadership within Hamas. So we're talking about the military commander of Hamas, as well as the leader of Hamas, who's based in Syria, want to make Jerusalem the center focus, as well as Judea and Samaria, or what the West calls the West Bank. But the leader in Gaza, the Hamas leader in Gaza, wants to make Gaza the focus. And this is why with so many different rockets and missiles that are being fired now to say, look, we are the leaders in this attack against Israel. But this really has taken Israel by surprise, that's for sure.
So as we're observing, we're talking about the complexity, the situation a little bit before the show, Simon. And it appears that Hamas is, its primary focus is Tel Aviv, Ashkelon,
it's rocket targets.
It's rocket targets. It's primary rocket targets. So that's the challenge there for the Israeli government.
But these rockets and missiles now are so sophisticated. They're reaching as far as Tel Aviv, which before and prior to 2014 was immune from any conflict. They thought that this was an oasis in the Middle East where everything happening in the region doesn't affect Tel Aviv. Well, it does now. And I've got very, very close friends I consider like family who live in Herzliya. And in 2014, rockets and missiles came as far north as Herzliya. But we've also had attacks on Jerusalem as well, and these rockets and missiles have hit Jerusalem as well. But we also realized that in the north, in Lebanon, Hezbollah have something like 50 or 60,000, no, I think it's 120,000 rockets and missiles aimed at Israel. And Israel's afraid that they would get precision-guided missiles that could actually reach as far as the south of Israel. And let's not forget that last month, back in April, there was a strayed Syrian missile that flew 125 miles into Israel and came close to Israel's nuclear site in Dimona. Yeah. Now, if it hit that nuclear site, we're talking about a kind of nuclear devastation. Catastrophe and stuff as well. So, yeah, I mean, I've spoken to a few Israelis today from the Israeli Foreign Ministry. I messaged them, and they're all shocked by the speed of events and what's happening there. It's taken Israel by surprise.
Yeah, here we have this. This is a very disturbing story that's coming in on Al Jazeera News. Was interviewing a Jewish resident, and he said the Palestinians shot an 85-year-old female Holocaust survivor in her wheelchair. Israeli defense then said, we shall go on bombing Hamas until they stop firing rockets. That's from Gordon. So we're getting some individual stories that are being reported in bits and pieces via various media outlets that are incredibly shocking. But the UN is saying we're headed towards very likely a full-scale war. We have the powers that be in the Israeli government, particularly the Prime Minister, saying that there will not be a ceasing of this until all is quiet in regard to Gaza continuing to fire missiles. So Israel will continue to defend itself. It will continue to respond until such a moment occurs that there's a ceasefire. Is a ceasefire likely, Simon? I mean, what do you think?
Not at the moment. Not until Israel effectively takes out so many of the Hamas rockets and missiles and their launching stations. This is why Israel only yesterday launched Operation Guardian of Walls. And let's quote the Israeli Prime Minister, who said in a press conference yesterday, he said, "We are in the midst of a major campaign, Operation Guardian of Walls. Yesterday and today, the IDF attacked hundreds of Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorist targets in the Gaza Strip. We have eliminated dozens of terrorists, including senior commanders. We have bombed Hamas command centers and toppled buildings that serve the terrorist organizations. We will continue attack with all force. We have just finished a consultation and assessment of the situation with heads of the security establishment, and we've made decisions. Hamas and Islamic Jihad have paid. I tell you here, we pay a heavy price for their aggression. I say here this evening, their blood is on their heads. Citizens of Israel, we stand united against a reprehensible enemy. We all grieve for those who've been killed. We pray for the well-being of the wounded. We all stand behind the IDF and the security forces."
Simon, looking at all of the escalation of this, can we go back to the source and identify any one particular moment where we see escalation begin? I mean, what exactly has led to this point?
What I didn't know until today was the fact that this has been months. It's brewing for months. It started back in April, and we saw through Palestinian Media Watch the increased incitement against Israel on the kind of Palestinian Authority media outlets. And if I look at some of the other dates here, so what else we've got here is
the TikTok stuff that was happening. Where,
yeah, so here we go. This one, according to this one, so we've also got, yeah, absolutely. So the other thing we've got as well is these horrible attacks on Jewish residents. So the first major attack was back in, I think, April, where we saw a rabbi attacked. Do you know where he was attacked?
Rabbi
Jaffa in
yes,
Tel Aviv
Jaffa.
by 3 Israeli Arabs. And then we saw a Jewish resident going into the old city of Jerusalem, where a Palestinian Arab poured what was only can described as probably boiling water or boiling liquid over him, which then sparked riots. And so therefore the Israeli police came to actually arrest the perpetrator. That demonstrated in violence. And then we had these a large number of escalation attacks against ordinary Jewish people filmed on social media, on TikTok, by the perpetrators to see how many likes they could get.
A TikTok intifada.
Yeah, and that's what it was named. So it's just absolutely crazy.
I remember, Simon, seeing a video at that point, and I thought, this is incredibly chilling. I thought it was just a kind of a trend of sick anti-Semitism that was occurring in isolated incidents. But it's all a part of this bigger picture, a puzzle really, that's coming together, and it's now reached a tipping point of full-on escalation.
Absolutely. And of course, back in April as well, we had another series of attacks by the Damascus Gate in the old city of Jerusalem. We also see then Hamas started to get in on the act and fired 36 rockets from Gaza in late April that targeted Israeli towns and villages near Gaza. This was followed, as I mentioned, by Israel's northern border after the Iranian Revolutionary Guards have tried to set up positions in Syria, close to Israel's border, in which to launch attacks against Israel. So Israel responded with precision airstrikes on their positions, which resulted on the 22nd of April, a Syrian SA-5 missile, as I said, flew 125 miles into Israel and landed near Israel's nuclear site in Dimona. Then we see the first week of May that the Palestinian Authority actually announced the cancellation of the Palestinian elections for the Palestinian Authority, in which Mahmoud Abbas actually was advised by the Biden administration to do that, because he said, if you want to win support for a Palestinian state, you want American backing, have elections, and it proves that you're a Democrat. Because we know they haven't had any for 15 years. So he actually went against the advice of his own supporters and those in his own cabinet, and of course then has created a massive mess in a situation, because he knows that he's going to be overthrown by Hamas or even Marwan Barghouti, who was leader of the Tanzim, who fought against Israel in the last Intifada back in 2000.
On May the 3rd, 3 Israeli teenagers were at a bus stop in Samaria. They were gunned down, and Yehuda Guetta later died of his wounds. There's another who's in a serious condition, and there's a third who escaped with minor injuries. On May 5th, Hamas resumed sending incendiary balloon devices from Gaza to start fires in Israel, and had small bombs on them that could have caused death. May 7th, Israeli forces stopped Palestinian terror cells and they opened fire on an Israeli checkpoint when they were stopped by Israeli soldiers at the checkpoint. And then this led, eventually we see on May 7th, in a separate incident, but pre-planned, as you indicated, the riots that were taking place on the Temple Mount. And hundreds were injured, Israeli police officers. It was spreading riots around throughout the old city, Damascus Gate area. Chaos across Jerusalem, chaos across the whole of the western side of the nation. And it looks at this moment as though that's going to continue unabated for the time being. We have an email here. This is from Anita. Evening, Simon and Regan. It's always a pleasure to be tuned into you both. As usual, I noted that the Labour Party have called for a stop to the rockets, but are focused on the expulsion of Palestinians from certain areas of occupied East Jerusalem. The news coverage, however, has recognized Israel's need to defend themselves. Unlike Trump, Biden hasn't appointed an ambassador to Israel yet. The U.S. government have recognized Israel's right to defend itself, though, and even the Russians have called for a meeting of 4 international mediators for resolving the conflict. The terrible thing is that so many innocent lives are being lost and will continue to be lost until this awful conflict can be resolved. I'll be continuing to pray for peace. Susan says, I can understand the strategy of containment that the Israelis are practicing. Imagine if they did conquer the enemy. They then would have to police them and forces would be thinned out. Then what? And the Iranians are waiting for the slightest chink to be opened and Israel being weakened. Perhaps recent agreements with the surrounding powers will falter. They then would throw everything at Israel, and if it hits the Al-Aqsa Mosque, so what? They do not want God to be lifted up by the Israelis. They want their own God to succeed. God protect the innocent on every side.
I suppose the other equation we have to think about is this one, is that the Turks and the Iranians want to exploit the situation to drive a wedge between Jerusalem and the Biden administration in the States, because they know with the Democrats, there is a huge element within the Democratic Party that are taking an increasingly anti-Israel position. We know that President Biden, for example, took him over 30 days, I think, maybe even more, to actually phone the Prime Minister on his, the Israeli Prime Minister, is Benjamin Netanyahu. And there was the start of this kind of very frosty relationship between the Democrats and the nation of Israel. So what this will do, it will antagonize the US administration. Yes, they'll call for calm, but essentially they'll start to place more pressure on Israel. And we see that Israel will be isolated even more. We're already seeing that the Abraham Accords that President Trump engineered last year are starting to break down. As I said before, the Saudis now are looking to restore relations with Iran, and they hate each other. The Sunnis and the Shias absolutely hate each other. So they're seeking reconciliation because they're recognizing this is the power shift. Before, the power shift under Trump was Israel and the Saudis and the Gulf states, and now it's the Iranians. So and the Palestinians. So it's not even sensible policy. So effectively, what we're seeing here is reaping a whirlwind, and of dangerous, disastrous, thoughtless policies in the Middle East put together by Biden to empower Israel's enemies. And we're seeing the consequences.
Now, one thing that I'm hopeful for here, Simon, and another viewer has noticed this, Norma's noticed this, is that potentially some of the mainstream outlets that normally are the first to jump on Israel's back and say, horrible, you're to blame for this, they're having to recognize that Gaza fired the rockets, and they're not trying to cover over. Yes, they're maybe trying to maximize certain things in regard to Israel's response. But Norma says, I was surprised that secular news did not blame Israel for starting the bombing. They're still not saying that Hamas is using the Palestinians as cannon fodder. That's true. When the Israelis blow up the Hamas bloc. Sometimes I've read a couple of articles, Norma, where you can kind of infer and read between the lines, and they're just trying not to say it. But the news did say that the Israelis sent a warning. How long will this slightly better reporting keep happening?
It doesn't last long.
Better. It doesn't, does it?
Operation Protective Edge started off like this. Israel was getting fair coverage to begin with. And then as soon as you have the Hamas PR propaganda machine kick into place, that's when everything changes. When journalists are then sent to Gaza, they are under Hamas's influence, and therefore they have to submit their stories and their video broadcasts to the Hamas authorities. And if it doesn't fit the Hamas narrative, their lives are threatened. And we also then start to see the imageries of the dead bodies, pulling out dead bodies, even if they are Hamas terrorists themselves, putting them on the street, showing babies and children crying outside bomb buildings. And of course, that is when public opinion starts to change, because that is the Hamas strategy. It is to use the media to influence public opinion that will then influence government policy, so they end up taking a more hostile position towards Israel. And sadly, we're in the same situation as we were in 2014. Earlier today, I interviewed Israel's spokesman at the Israeli embassy, Ahad Zemit, to get his thoughts on the current crisis that we're seeing in Israel.
Ahad, warm welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. But sadly, we're not talking today about the success of Israel in dealing with COVID-19, coming up with global solutions to this pandemic. We're not discussing how the British government has put Israel on the green passport list, one of the very few countries. But sadly, today we are talking about the rockets and missiles that are hitting Israel. Israel seems to be in the biggest crisis she's faced since 2014. Can you explain to us the situation and the crisis that Israel is currently facing?
So currently, Israel is under attack. You know, I have a family in Tel Aviv. My grandmother, all the night, you needed to go to air shelters. There were air sirens, people were killed. There were hundreds of missiles firing at cities in Israel, and people are getting killed. And the citizens of Israel, they demand action. They demand the government. They ask the government to protect themselves. And this is exactly what we do. It's unfortunate that on the other side, you have this radical religious organization, radical theocratic organization, jihadi organization called Hamas, with its agenda of firing rockets at Israel. We did everything possible to de-escalate the situation. They said it's Jerusalem. We even stopped visits for the mount by Jews. But when rockets are being fired at Israel, there is nothing other we can do than to target and to defend those who fired us.
And this is the worst violence that we've seen being targeted against Israel for 7 years, since going back to 2014. Can you just give us some context of how this violence started? I mean, we saw the violent riots take place on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and this is then followed by these horrendous Hamas rockets and missiles that are targeting innocent Israeli civilians in central Israel and also southern Israel.
Yes. So how it started? It's this holy month of Ramadan. Every year, the hundreds of thousands of worshippers come to the Temple Mount. Israel did always and will continue to uphold freedom of religion for all faiths. Jerusalem is a very sensitive area. You have Muslims, you have Christians, holy sites, and Israel. And since 1967, since Israel regained or gained sovereignty in Jerusalem, we make sure every religion can practice its faith. But unfortunately, you have people using this holy time and this holy site to incite to violence. We see people stockpiling. Even this morning, we see people stockpiling stones, throwing them, rocks, throwing them, and flares on the police, on civilians praying in the Western Wall, just adjacent to the Temple Mount. And the police need to police the area. This is their job, like any police force around the world. They need to stop the violence. They need to safeguard people's life. And it's really, really unfortunate that this holy site is being used to incite to violence for political purposes.
And Ahad, I mean, I don't think any country can really comprehend what it's like to face over 1,000 Hamas rockets and missiles, and there is targeted places in southern Israel as well as in central Israel as well. What is it like for those communities that are under the umbrella of these rockets and missiles, and how are they coping?
Simon, I don't know if you've seen the video from yesterday of, I don't know, many missiles fired at Israel, and they're being intercepted in the sky by our Iron Dome system. Actually, Israel invested heavily in protecting its citizens. Imagine what would have happened if all those missiles would have just landed indiscriminately on homes, on buses, like we've seen yesterday. Of course, this defensive system is not perfect, and killing people. Imagine what the reaction will be from Israeli citizens that demand and ask their government to protect them. We will do everything in our power to protect our citizens, but we have to remember that Israel, in the first place, invest in defense.
And Ahad as well. I mean, sadly, that 5 Israelis have lost their lives in this completely unnecessary conflict. What is the Israeli Defense Force prepared to do in order to protect their citizens from these rockets and missiles? And let's remind the mainstream media and remind politicians in Britain that these missiles kill.
These missiles kill. This is, they are being manufactured with the help of the Iranians in Gaza. They've been stockpiled for years, and they kill, and they are a threat to any country. My family in Tel Aviv, rockets being fired at. It's dangerous. It's scary. It's not anything any country would have wanted its citizens to experience. Of course, what happened in Gaza, it's also unfortunate. It's unfortunate that Hamas is using these people as human shields. It's unfortunate that people suffer. No one wanted this war, and we, of course, don't want this escalation. We called for the escalations, but when you have this radical jihadi organization that wants to replace Israel with this theocratic state, This is what we have to do in order to protect ourselves and to protect our values.
And Ahad, we see that Israel has launched airstrikes into Gaza and currently targeted over 500 Hamas targets, including Hamas terrorists as well, and killed a few of them. Can you just explain to us and to our viewers the length that Israel goes to avoid civilian casualties? Because we know that Hamas don't play by the rules, they don't comply to the Geneva Convention, and they hide behind women and children when firing these rockets, firing them from schools and hospitals, which makes it very, very difficult for Israel to target these Hamas terrorists in Gaza.
Yes, Israel, as other democratic countries, as the UK, adhere to international law and does everything according to international law. We actually have a very close legal advice to the IDF. I personally was a lawyer before in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs before coming into London, so I can tell you on first hand. And every target that the army is targeting is being assessed, and we target only Hamas targets. And when we target, we do it in a proportional manner, only to achieve the military objective, which is to stop the rockets. And this is what we do, and this is what we are obliged to do. And of course, we are facing this organization that doesn't really care about the international community, about the rule-based system. They want to replace us. They want to replace the international rule-based system with this theocratic state. So we have to do whatever we can to face it and to stop it.
And Ahad, how much of the recent troubles that we've seen, not only in Jerusalem, but also with Hamas firing rockets and missiles, an internal Palestinian issue? Because we heard earlier in the year that the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, said he was announced elections the first time in 15 years, and now is wanting to find an excuse not to have those elections, fearing that him and the PLO will not get re-elected in the Palestinian Authority. So how much is this internal Palestinian politics rather as a distraction from their actual troubles?
How it all happened, how it all started, is when the Palestinian Authority decided to cancel the election after 10 years they haven't held election. Hamas thought they will win at least some or will gain some power through the elections. And you have, on the one hand, Hamas wants to influence and gain more power by using violence for its own political gains. On the other hand, you have the Palestinian Authority also incite to violence to distract the public, and they use these holy times, these holy sites. And Israel really, really tried to de-escalate the situation. We don't want to see this violence. We didn't want to see, and we still don't want to see it. But when you have these groups inciting, when they use holy places and holy sites, this is the result, and it's very, very unfortunate.
And how much can we look at the current situation of violence that we're seeing, that Israel's being targeted, not only in Jerusalem, but also in southern and central Israel through these Hamas rockets and missiles, down to what's happening in the region? The fact is that the Iranians are being brought in from the cold, and there's talks of re-engaging in the Iranian nuclear deal. Also, the refunding of the Palestinian Authority by the US administration. How much do you think that these regional factors are playing their part in this escalation of violence that we're seeing towards Israel?
You have to see who supports Hamas and who is happy and advocates for this kind of violence. You see Iran with this radical regime that fund Hamas, helps Hamas with training, funds Hezbollah in the north of Israel, and all other proxies and terrorist groups around the region. And this is what they do. This is what they want. They want to destabilize the region in order to spread their radical ideology. So we have in the Middle East, you can see the Middle East is split between these forces like Iran, like Syria, like Hezbollah wants to have a radical ideology, a radical change to use violence. On the other hand, you have countries actually wants to engage with Israel and wants to to have prosperity and development. And I really hope this violence will end, and we will continue to reach our hand in peace and to talk with as many people than we used to speak with them in the past, and the Middle East will be a better place, hopefully.
And finally, what role can our Christian viewers play in defending and standing with Israel and the Jewish people at this real crisis that Israel's currently facing today?
I think first of all, it's important to stress how Israel safeguards, freedom of worship for all religions, and how important it is for us, and how we represent, I believe, Israel with its democratic values, represent something good and positive in the region, and we value any support that could be given to us, either through speaking, advocating for Israel, speaking with your neighbors, tell him, sometimes he doesn't understand, explain to him about the situation, speak if you're British, or speak with your MP, or an American, speak with your representative. Talk with them, explain to them how important it is to support Israel and how right and is the Israeli cause.
And Had, thank you so much for joining us on Behind Headlines. And just to let you know that our thoughts, our prayers are with you and the Israeli people in this moment of crisis, and that we will continue to fight for the righteousness of Israel's cause, because Israel is under attack, and this is a rallying call for all of us to defend the one and only Jewish state that is the nation of Israel.
Thank you, Simon. I'm glad to be here, as always.
Some very helpful first-hand reporting there. Thank you for that interview, Simon. Hi, guys. Why attack Israel now? It's a perfect storm. Abbas wanted an excuse for cancelling the elections, so he picked on a property court case, Sheikh Jarrah, which had been settled. Many young Arabs had smuggled stones and firecrackers into the Al-Aqsa Mosque in preparation for a planned altercation. They began to stone Israeli police from above and set the firecrackers off, so the police would investigate the explosion and so be accused of storming the mosque. Hamas, not to be outdone by Abbas, decided to send rockets into Israel. There's a day at the end of Ramadan which Muslims believe will bring 1,000-fold blessings from Allah if they commit jihad on that day. It was, I believe, Saturday, 8th of May this year, the very day all of this started. So I would say, yes, ISIS has indicated in previous years, obviously this is a separate situation, but the ideology is still Islamic, that indeed in Ramadan there is a greater reward for waging jihad. There's a hadith by Ibn Raja al-Hanbali, which indicates that there is some special blessing for waging holy war at the end of Ramadan. So, Maggie, I think that's a helpful observation. But one thing, Simon, that we're getting a lot of here, that people are asking this question about where this fits in times prophecy. So we have
time of Jacob's trouble, and we did a program only a couple of weeks ago looking at Matthew 24, what the birth pains, wars and rumors of wars. So I think that's an indication, but it's also an indication, I think we're also seeing possibly the players move together in terms of Ezekiel 38 and 39. I personally don't believe that that's anytime soon, but the players are certainly moving together because it talks about Israel living in peace and safety. It talks about Israel having no borders. And Israel's not living in peace and safety right now, and Israel definitely has borders. So we can see that alliance being more formed by the Turks and the Russians and the Iranians. So that's very much on the cards. And also Israel's increasing isolation, sadly, internationally as well. And this is where Christians have to step up to the mark. This is where we need to continue to seek the God of Israel in prayer and intercession, to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. That is a command. We need to intercede, we need to stand by Israel, and we need to counter the hate and the lies from our mainstream media, from our politicians, and also from some of these hate-filled pro-Palestinian demonstrations that we've seen over the last couple of days.
Dory asks, do you think this is lead up to the Gog and Magog war? You've kind of answered that question, Ezekiel 38 and 39. You know, you believe it's sometime off from your perspective, but I think, you know, Dory, we can see how God is working out all things to a particular end point. We don't obviously know when that is at this point in time, but all we can be assured is playing a role in the build-up, as Simon said. Could this war be preparing the way for the false peace brokered by the Antichrist? This is another question that is asked, but I think the conclusion, you know, we could say, well, could it be? Well, yes, it could be. We can't be overly dogmatic.
Look, prophecy is important because it indicates where we are prophetically in terms of God's prophetic time clock, and Israel is God's prophetic time clock. But there's also another factor involved in this, and this is the human factor, that there are Israelis living in southern Israel and central Israel that are facing these rockets and missiles raining over them, which creates death. It paralyzes the country. People are in fear, running to bomb shelters in order to find protection and peace. We saw that video of that young, that brother, courageous brother, protecting his daughter, protecting his sister in this situation. So I think we have to also include the human factor here, that these are God's chosen people. This is his promised land, and that God has redeemed the Jewish people from the four corners of the earth and brought them back into their land. We've only just celebrated Israel's 73rd anniversary as a nation reborn. And so therefore, I think we have a moral obligation as Christians to stand with the Jewish people, to stand with Israel while they're being under attack, and to pray and intercede for them, because Israel is under attack.
The covenant-keeping God of Israel has and will fight for them. We've said it time and time again that God neither slumbers nor sleeps. He is looking after the people who are there in Israel, who are in Jerusalem. We should continue to pray. That's our Christian responsibility, to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. We need to recognize the ongoing significance of God's protection of Israel up to this point. Simon, we've talked about all of the wars that have happened and all of the threats against Israel. In human terms, it should not exist. In human terms, Israel, as we're discussing it now as a Jewish state, should not even be there, yet it is. It is there in God's providence, according to his perfect plan and purpose, and in line with the fact that he is a covenant-keeping God. And the covenants, the promises of God are irrevocable. Amen. So he said, after you go into exile, I'm going to bring you all back, and there will be redemption. So we have, I'll read one final email. This is from Allison. Unfortunately, we now have so many megalomaniac nations and regimes: Hamas, Iran, Russia, Chinese, Turkey, North Korea, and now Biden, big time to say the least. And I'm praying big time, especially for Jerusalem and Israel, of course. God bless you.
I mean, what I think, because we only got like a minute and a half left of the program, I think it's also very important to bring to the equation in this program today that in terms of Israel's enemies, the gloves are off. Israel had protection for 4 years under President Trump and his administration. And we're seeing that, that the Democrats under Biden are lukewarm at best. And this is empowering the enemies of Israel to act revenge on the support that Trump gave Israel over the past 4 years. And this is why we're seeing such an escalation in violence targeting Israel and the Jewish people. And, you know, the only way this is going to be resolved, I think, is through prayer and intercession, but also for Israel to give Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad a real, dumbing down of their defense capabilities.
To fulfill their promise. To fulfill their promise, and to say, until there's complete quiet, we will continue to respond in this way. Viewers, please remember to pray. Even as the program ends, be praying for Israel, be praying for the safety of many. Pray that God will intervene in a mighty and powerful way.
Great doing a programme with you, Regan. And just want to thank you for watching tonight's Behind the Headlines. Let's remember, Israel is under attack. Let's step up our prayers. Let's step up our support for Israel and the Jewish community. If there are rallies that are taking place, attend them. Write to our MPs and also our journalists, because we know that Israel is under attack. But the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob is sovereign and he's in control. So we look to him for Israel's deliverance. So thank you for watching Behind the Headlines.